I'm going to take about 30 minutes or so, 25, 30 minutes, and walk you through some of the things that are occurring, at least nationally. Think some trends that we're seeing, some trends that likely you're seeing right in your context, and then try to answer the question, okay, what do we do about this? Because we are coming out of a season in the life of the church and in the life of our nation that can be difficult to understand and to navigate in terms of leadership. So I want to talk about some things that I will call right now realities, and things that are right in front of you, and how I believe that though we're we're coming out of a pandemic, I think that things are going to be better even if they're harder. And let me explain. So why is 2021, we're coming up on the halfway point in 2021. Why is this harder? And maybe you're feeling it. It was almost as if, I know, at least in my own church, those first month or two during the pandemic, people seemed to be energized, even if we were doing things digitally. And it was, there's a lot of hope that, hey, we're gonna get through this quickly. And then that hope quickly faded because we realized that this was going to be a longer term impact than just, I remember our worst case scenario was 12 weeks, I think, in terms of the impact. And here we are over a year later, and we're still dealing with stuff. So the momentum is gone. That's kind of the first thing that I think many of you feel. I have heard some anomalies. I've heard some stories of churches that grew through the pandemic, that they gained momentum. And if that's your church, hey, you should be praising God, because most churches feel the loss of momentum. They see it in the attendance, and they see it in the giving, the spiritual fruit, the baptisms, all sorts of stuff. So attendance, we're expecting by the time this all settles, probably this fall, depends on your community. Chicago's a little different than Florida, a little different than California, a little different than New York, Texas, obviously, a little different than all of that as well. So a lot of it's going to depend on your context, but I would assume for most of you in the Dallas Baptist Association, you're going to see things really settle in the fall. Obviously, summer can be a lull. And as you come out of summer and into the fall, what we're expecting is a baseline of about 80%. Meaning, if your attendance was 100, you should expect your attendance going forward to be about 80. So you're going to lose about 20% of your people. And there's not a whole lot that you can do about that. Now, that's average. You may say, hey, we're at 90, or hey, yeah, we're 65, 70. That's average. We also expect giving to be off slightly. Now, the caveat there is the government is handing out money and people are giving through that stimulus. So you may have seen an uptick in your giving of late. That may be, don't know your own church, but may be partly due to the stimulus that the government has put out there. That will end one way or the other. That's going to end, and that will impact giving. So we're also expecting giving to be off about the same amount going forward. So momentum has kind of been sucked out of the air a little bit. And another thing that's driving that is just people have developed new routines through the pandemic. Sporting events aren't as well attended, Disney and concerts and stuff. There's going to be a mad rush back into this stuff, but a lot of people have developed new patterns, and those new patterns and those new routines exclude the in-person gathering. Now, your church may have gotten through that, and you may have encouraged your people to start attending again and being in person, and your church may be in a good place, but a lot of churches are not. So if you're saying, man, yeah, we're struggling with this, we're struggling to get people back, we're struggling to get back to our pre-pandemic attendance, that's the norm. We're seeing that more than norm. There's also, again, on this theme of, okay, where did the momentum go? Even though the government has issued a lot of stimulus, whatever you think about that, it's happened, there's still a lot of uncertainty in the economic environment. And you even see this with some of the experts so-called experts who talk about the financial system. There's questions, right? So part of what's losing the momentum are the questions around, is the market overheated? Are we going to see inflation? Is this temporary short-term bounce that we see with the stimulus, is there going to be a vacuum on the other side of it where things really crash? I'm certainly not going to predict a market crash. I'm not a financial advisor. And though I was in the financial services industry, I did energy futures, not stocks. So I can't really predict one way or the other. But there is a lot of uncertainty there. And there's a lot of debate among, even at the Federal Reserve level, like, what do we do about inflation? How high is this going to get? What will this look like? So there's a lot of economic uncertainty as well. Add to that, so you've got these outside factors coming in. Add to that the internal that a lot of pastors feel right now. There are those who are considering a transition. There are the, maybe that's you, transitioning to another church. Okay, I got my church through the pandemic. Might be time to move on. There are pastors who are considering early retirement. Hey, I was going to retire at like 70 or 72 or 74, but 68 sounding really nice right now. So there are those who are considering retiring earlier than they thought they would. Pastors are struggling with decision fatigue, meaning I have had to make so many oddball, off-topic decisions through this pandemic. I am just flat out tired of making these kinds of decisions. So you're leading from a place of decision fatigue. That's very common. There are those who are pastors looking for a change of scenery. I've seen that at Church Answers, where pastors in California and New York in particular, Chicago as well. I'm coaching them, I'm talking to them, and they're struggling with the level of government that has imposed upon them. Again, whatever you feel about that way, whatever your take on that is, that's what pastors are feeling. So I'm just talking about what they're feeling. So there are many who are looking at what has happened in their own community, and they're considering a change of scenery. There are some pastors who have lost loved ones through the pandemic. There's been a staggering loss of life in the nation through all of this. Yes, were those who thought it would be worse and they were wrong? Yes. But regardless, if you've lost a loved one, well, that has impacted you greatly. And there are those who are like, hey, I'm going to move back closer to home. I lost a family member. I want to be closer to family. And then some just have a new sense of calling. Sometimes a crisis prompts reflection, and that reflection leads you to a new sense of calling. And then the last thing we're seeing with pastors is a lot of them got pushed out. There were power groups that surfaced during the pandemic that did some terrible things and pushed pastors out during COVID, which is just awful. But there are a lot of stories out there. Maybe you survived it. Maybe you're like, man, I had an effort where they tried to do that. It happened at my church. The group didn't get anywhere, but they tried. So the momentum is gone, partly because of new routines that exclude church. They just stopped coming, so they have gotten out of the habit. There's economic uncertainty. There's this great reshuffling with pastors as they consider what's going on in their world. And then you're seeing other trends that aren't necessarily bad, but are kind of rising with everything that's going on. There's a growth of co-vocational ministry. It's a little different than bivocational in the way that we define it at Church Answers. Bivocational is the idea that if I could be full-time, I would be. And maybe you're bivocational intentionally. That's the way I started, but I'm going to use a new term, co-vocational, to describe those who are intentionally part-time at their church, full-time someplace else, or sharing their profession with the church. So I consider myself co-vocational and president of Church Answers. I also pastor a church. That's the way I believe God has called me to do it. That may change in the future, but that's the way that it is now. So you have the rise of part-time positions in the church. That's the way to look at it. Some would desire to be full-time, but they have to be part-time. Some are intentionally co-vocational. Regardless, you're going to see more of this, not less. The idea that, hey, we have a need in the church, let's go hire somebody full-time to fit this need, those days are ending. So there's some hurdles with the church. There's some things that are headwinds, to use a cliche, and it has sucked the air out of the room, so to speak. And not all of these things are bad. Just because you're considering a transition, or just because you decide to go bivocational or co-vocational, those aren't bad things. But it can cause the church, it can be harder for the church to move forward with all of these different kinds of headwinds. So these are some of the trends that we're seeing nationally. I went through that quickly. You can certainly ask questions about it when I'm done if you've got some questions there. But I do want to get to the material of like, okay, what's the solution? So we've got these headwinds. So here's some things that are more on the positive side that we're seeing coming out of a pandemic. We're not quite there yet, and hopefully we will be soon. But I anticipate by the fall that things will be across the nation for the most part back to quote unquote normal, whatever that is. So here's some things that I think are more on the positive side. Your people are likely as flexible as they've ever been in the church because of the pandemic. Now, maybe you're sitting here going, nah, my people have never been flexible. And they're still not really all that flexible, but there is an improvement. So I'm not saying that every church is willing to do whatever, but there is an increased amount of flexibility within the church. There's not as much stodginess. And I think that God used the pandemic to help us get rid of some of that, what can amount to toxicity in the church with being stuck in a rut and not willing to move. But you're seeing more flexibility in the church. I've seen it in my church. I've seen it in the churches that we serve through Church Answers. And with that, okay, so you've lost 20% on average. That's just the average. So you've lost 20% of your people. They're not coming back for whatever reason. A lot of those were fringe. A lot of those were periphery. They were kind of fading anyway. They used to come 2 out of 4, 3 out of 4 weeks, and then they were basically at 1 out of 5 now. And so the pandemic, what was the trend, what the pandemic did with a lot of church trends is it just accelerated what was already in place. So you lost that 20% that were fading or on the periphery, but what you're left with is a much stronger core. Here is something that you found out likely through the pandemic. You know who your core is now, and your core is stronger than ever. They're the ones who gave to the church during this time, who stepped up their giving to help you get through cash crunches. They're the ones who served even though they had some health concerns. They're the ones who stepped up and said, to the glory of God, I'm going to put myself out there. I don't know what this pandemic involves. I'm a little uncertain about this virus, but you know what? I'm still going to serve the church. Your core is likely as strong as it's ever been. Those that were with you through the pandemic and are still there with you, man, they are really with you. So you've got a little bit more flexibility. Maybe some of you have a lot more flexibility. Your core has strengthened, even if you've lost the periphery. So your attendance may be off, but man, people are really bought in now. And when you accelerate change in the church without really intending to, the way the pandemic did, it means that mission can now replace preference. It means that we can set aside the things that we just prefer and really focus on the things that matter. And that old cliche, keep the main thing, is something that I think that churches are starting to do now, and that's positive. The other thing that you will notice in churches is how creativity flourished. Creativity, good art comes from a place of tension. Rarely is good art produced in a quiet, serene environment. Good art is produced from a point of tension, and creativity flourishes in times of trouble. Creativity flourishes when you have to be creative. We saw a lot of churches do that. I know West Bradenton went from 0 digital presence. I mean, nothing. I mean, we had a podcast that hadn't been updated in months. Let's just put it that way. That's about it. 0 digital presence. And now we're pre-producing every service. We've got a whole system in place that we've done, that we've kept through the pandemic. Many of you have done similar things creatively. If you're exhausted, here's another positive thing. If you're exhausted, it also means that you are less self-reliant. So there is a greater dependence upon God. There's a greater dependence upon the Holy Spirit. In fact, there were days during the pandemic where I had no clue what I was doing, and it was but by the grace of God, it was but by the power of the Holy Spirit that got me through it. So a little less reliance on our own abilities and a little more reliance on God's power through the Holy Spirit is definitely a benefit from what we've all been through. And the other thing that I'll say, and then I'll get to some solutions. So we're talking about why 2021 is a little harder, why 2021 is a little better. The last thing I'll say in that better category is that, and if you pastor a mega church, I don't mean to pull you down at all. That's not my goal. I would imagine that most who are on this call are smaller or mid-sized churches. So, but I don't want to exclude those who are larger churches. Um, but one of the things that we're seeing at Church Answers and that we're tracking very closely is that smaller and mid-sized churches are recovering much more quickly than larger churches. It's a little hard to get the larger churches to tell you exactly what's going on for many reasons, but whereas a larger church, mega church, whatever you want to call it, may have 50 or 60% people back, the smaller churches seem to have 70, 80, 90% of their people back. So the smaller churches are recovering more quickly. I think that's in part due to how people feel about being in large groups. But I also believe that there was a trend this way that the pandemic accelerated. So if you look at the number of mega churches in the United States in 2010, and they go all the way up to the point right before the pandemic, that number is the same. So we're not seeing any new number of mega churches out there. It was a trend. It was a baby boomer trend. It was a baby boomer phenomenon that lasted in the late 70s, 80s, and 90s up into the early 2000s. By the time you get to the 2010 timeframe, there are new mega churches, and some that are big are getting bigger, of course. But it's not what started with basically Moody in the early 1900s, one mega church in the United States, got to about 1,700 in, depending on how you count them, but about 1,700 in 2010. And guess what? Right before the pandemic, we had about 1,700 mega churches. There's some that decline and some that come back, that are new, that grow into mega church, but the phenomenon is waning. And the pandemic accelerated something that was already in place. So when we're talking about smaller and mid-sized churches recovering more quickly, does it have to do with just the fact that they're smaller and mid-sized and people are just uncomfortable in large settings? Yeah, I think that's part of it. But I also think a big part of it is that these churches were primed anyway because of the culture that is changing, particularly with millennials and their children. By the way, millennials are not young. I'm 41. I'm a millennial. I have 5 kids. Millennials are the ones in your church that are pushing middle age and have children. And the millennial movement there is the potential with millennials and their kids to move into smaller and mid-sized churches. Now, you have to do your job if you're a smaller and mid-sized church. It's not like they're just going to start showing up. You have to be doing what you're supposed to be doing. But your recovery is likely going to be more rapid if you're smaller and mid-sized, if you do the things that you're supposed to do, than say a mega church. It's harder to fill the room. We'll just say that if you have a 5,000 seat auditorium, which there are some churches that size, and a lot of them have done a lot of good, and some of them are still full, but a lot of them are struggling to fill the room. You're more apt to fill the room if it's 300, 400, not 4,000, 5,000. That is a demographic, sociological trend that we are seeing. So if you are in that category of smaller or mid-size, you do have a little bit of an upper hand, but it doesn't mean that they're just going to all flock back to the church. So what do you do to get people back? Now, here's the kind of the core of what I want to talk about today. And forgive me for running through this quickly. I have a lot of words, I have a lot of opinions, and I'm always glad to share them. So I tend to over prepare and have too much material. But that being said, I want to get to the core of what is important for you today. What do you do to get them back? How do we, as churches, as leaders, as an association, draw people back in? The first step is you need to know your community. Now, maybe you've pastored in your community for 20 years plus. Maybe you're like, hey, I've been here for 40 years. Do you really know your community? One of the things that we do at Church Answers is we have a Know Your Community report that is based upon drive time. It's a very different approach than some of the other demographic reports, which are fine. We're in competition with them. I think ours is better, but there's good ones out there, so I don't want to knock them too much. But do you really know your community? And asking this, um, you guys are all in the Dallas area, Metroplex area. I know a little bit about Dallas. You know, Fort Worth is its own thing, Dallas is its own thing, and there's a lot of little communities in between. So I understand the community breakdown a little bit, at least where you are. So let's just say 20 minutes, 20-minute drive time, 15-minute drive time, something that is fairly typical. 90% of your people roughly will not drive, will drive 20 minutes or under to church. It doesn't matter if you're a big church, small church, the vast majority of your people, and that's a recent study that just came out, are only driving 20 minutes or less to church. Let's do 20 minutes. How many people live within a 20-minute drive time from your church? Do you know? Do you know how many people live 20 minutes from your church? If you don't, if you can't rattle that off right off the top of your head, you probably need to dig a little deeper. That's often missed. There are 250,000 people that live within 20 minutes of my church. 250,000 in the Bradenton, Sarasota area. And we're way west. Most of our, if you were to draw a circle around our church 3 miles out, most of it's in water, because you got the Manatee River to the north and the Gulf of Mexico to the west. So a lot of our people say, no, there's no way that many people live that close to our church, and they do. You know, there's 4.5 million people in our area, but 250,000 that can easily get to our church. That's shocking to them. So how many people live within a drivable distance to your church? How many ethnic minorities are in that same area? Most people greatly underestimate how many ethnic minority people of color live close to the church. Ours is 40%. It shocked my people when I ran that report. That, well, 40, mainly Latinos, Hispanic people, but 40% ethnic minority. And then how many single moms live that close? Most of the time, it's greatly underestimated. So those are some things that we show in our Know Your Community report. That's the first thing that I would challenge you to do is, do you really know your community? And some of you may be able to rattle those numbers off and you've got them down and you're reaching them and you're doing it. That's great. Most people don't. So how do you get people back? Well, who are you getting back? What's the mission field? Who has the potential to come to your church? Let's get to know them. The other thing that you can do, so that's the first thing, know your community. The second thing is to increase attendance frequency. Now, this is, I don't like gimmicks, church growth gimmicks so much, but man, this is an important mathematical reality. Most people, well, what was active a long time ago was I come to church 3 times a week. Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night. And then we got to the point to where it was like once a week. And then like once a month was kind of an active church member. If you have a church that averages every other week for your people, let's say you have 200 people in your church that come every other week, which is pretty normal. That's a pretty normal church. Your average attendance is 100. So let that settle in. So I've got 200 people that come every other week. My average weekly attendance is 100. You take 200, divide it by half, you get 100. So I'm here every other week, average attendance 200. Let's say you get them to start coming 3 out of 4 weeks. The same 200 people. We're just going to get them to come, instead of every other week, they're going to come 3 out of 4 weeks. You increase your attendance by 50%. You grow your church by 50%. It goes from 100 to 150 at that point. So one of the things that we can do is we can start encouraging people to be at church more often and to give people reason to be there. Your groups, Sunday school, small groups, community groups, family groups, whatever you call them, your group's structure is the way to do this. And you have to be willing for it to be messy. It can't be clean cut. We have things that we've started called podcast groups, where people listen to a podcast that we've either produced ourselves or found out there in podcast world, which is free, by the way, free curriculum. It's free just to go listen to a podcast. Then they get together. We have a conversation facilitator that talks about the podcast. We have several groups where we've created just around podcasts, and they love it. They meet every week. It may not be for your church. It may not work where you are, but all of a sudden, people that were coming like once a month, man, they're wanting to show up every week because of just a different and novel way of doing groups. So I think groups is key to getting people back, getting them involved, even if it's a little different structure. And then the other thing is what I will call internal outreach. So how do you get people back? How do you get people there more often? All right, pull your database. Look at the 2,000 people that are quote unquote members, and just start calling them, not for the sake of purging them off the rolls, just for reaching out to them. We called it Project Reconnect. We just got on the phone and started calling people. Said, hey, you know, I haven't seen you in a while. Hope to see you soon. How are you doing? And that has benefited our church. We get a group of people, and every couple of years we'll do Project Reconnect. We'll start reaching out to people. Those are some ways to increase attendance frequency. Those two things so far. Know your community, increase attendance frequency. The way you increase attendance frequency is to have a strong group structure and to have a strong internal outreach. The other thing that I would encourage you to do is to rethink the way that you do strategy in the church. Vision, way overrated. Strategy, greatly underrated. Everyone's got a great vision statement now. Everyone's done the vision process. Everyone's got the vision statement plastered on the website. They've got it on the walls. Everyone's gone through this vision process, which is necessary and good. I mean, but no one can strategically accomplish the vision. So it seems we want to be this. How do we get there? So vision is the goal. That's the identity. That's the purpose. Some may call that mission, but I kind of make mission and vision the same thing. Strategy, though, is the pathway there. How are we going to do that? And then tactics are the steps that you take along the road to accomplish the strategy. So start thinking in terms of 6-month increments. Have a strategy for 6 months where you get the church doing one thing. So, all right, we want to grow our church. My church is a neighborhood church for the nations. That's our vision. We're a neighborhood church for the nations. That's who we want to be. That's our identity. All right, how are we going to do that? Well, we have a 6-month strategy to reach 1,000 homes around our church. And we're going to go door to door. And we are going to bring them gifts. We're just going to bring them gifts. Now, obviously, this is going to happen in the fall when it's a little cooler in Florida, and when people aren't quite as nervous about COVID. But we're going to identify 1,000 homes. We're just going to get to know. We're going to get to know our neighbor, and we're going to be a neighborhood church. We have a big steeple. You say, hey, you can see the steeple from your house. If you ever need anything, spiritual stuff, or just need help, or just want to get connected, we're your church. You can walk to our church. We've already seen people start showing up who can literally walk to our church. And we have a 6-month strategy to reach our neighborhood. And we focus on this door-to-door campaign for 6 months where we're going to do one thing for our neighbors each month. And we get the whole church involved, or as many as we can, and we go accomplish the goal. The vision is to be a neighborhood church for the nations. The strategy, at least for 6 months, is to go door to door. We're going to do things like Pray and Go. Maybe you've heard of that. It's a resource at Church Answers. You can do that as well. You can check it out at churchanswers.com. We have different resources to help you accomplish this thing. But yeah, 6-month strategies. We call them MHAGs, a play off of Jim Collins' BHAG, big, hairy, audacious goal. We call them middle, holy, audacious goals. Middle, 6 months. Holy, we want to do this for God's glory. Audacious, it's something you've never done before. And goal, it helps you accomplish the vision. So be thinking in terms of what you can do every 6 months. It is a freeing exercise. Instead of this 10-year vision of we want to accomplish all of these things, think in terms of 6-month strategies. Vision, overrated. Strategy, very much underrated. The other thing that I'll say, all right, how do you get people back? Know your community, increase attendance frequency, and 6-month strategies are all very beneficial. The other thing I'll say is just from a leadership perspective, from you personally, you as leaders in your church. And I think this very much applies to the Southern Baptist world right now. It applies to any denomination. We work with multiple denominations and groups and networks at Church Answers, but we have a lot of connections to the Southern Baptist Convention because that's my tribe and it's a tribe I love. So I'll just say this to all of you. Stop bridge burning and start bridge building, please. This is going to help your church. So if you are a Twitter warrior and you are constantly involved in SBC politics and you are constantly blasting your opinions out there, okay, it's your right to do that. And maybe your opinions are correct. Maybe you're spot on in what you're saying. But how is that helping your church? How is that helping equip your people? Um, Drama wears on your people. So be very careful about the drama that you invite into the church. It may be that it's necessary. It may be like, okay, this is a battle that we need to fight. This is something that is important, and it's a hill we're dying on. It's the thing that we really need to go after. Fair enough. Fair enough. It may be worth the effort, but your church can only take so much drama. Your church can only take so much denominational drama. And your church is paying attention. If you're involved in doing things, maybe you should be, but your church is paying attention. So you've only got so much energy in the church. There's only 24 hours in a day. There's only so many hours that your people will give you in a week, even your best people. And they only have so much energy to give. Where do you want that energy going? And I think that's a fair question of all of us. It's a fair question of me. I've had to pull back on some things in my own life because the drama was wearing on my own people. And I've had to make some decisions, strategic decisions as a leader of my church to say, okay, I'm going to try to build as many bridges as I can and burn as few, and only burn the ones that I absolutely have to. And even then, I really don't want to. So be careful where you put your energy. If you want people to come back, if that's the goal, and 50% of your time is dedicated to SBC politics, are you really accomplishing the goal? I think we can work together. That's a phrase that's often used, better together, right? Let's be better together. And the last thing I'll say is creating an invite culture in your church where people are wanting to invite others. And this begins with you. I'll end with the story and then I'll let you ask some questions. So the 5 things, how do you get people back? Real quick, know your community, increase attendance frequency, focus on 6-month strategies, outreach strategies. Let's be very careful for where our energy goes. And people only have so much energy. So if you're inviting drama into the church, that's sucking energy out of your church. And then lastly, number 5, an invite culture. Now, what does this look like? Let me tell you a story. It begins with you. I'll just say that. The invite culture begins with you. I was not pastoring, I was consulting a church in Indiana, far from Texas, but the principle applies. It was not part of the Southern Baptist Convention. But it was, if I remember right, it was a Baptist church. And they had an elder structure, which is different than probably some of you. But I had to talk to the elders about the decline in their church. And they had, at one point in their history, been about 800 people. And they had declined significantly over 40 years. It was a 40-year decline. And they had lost, on average, 8 people every year, which is almost imperceptible. I mean, if you go from 800 down to 792, your people, unless you just tell them, they don't notice that. But they had declined over 40 years, on average, 8 people a year. Very, very slow decline. So, 8 times 40, 320, they were down to 180 people. And all of a sudden, 40 years later, they had woken up and they were like, we're declining. And the church was convinced that it was their pastor. So I went before the elders and some of the key church leaders, and I said, your pastor is not even 30. He wasn't even born when you guys started your decline. He's only been here like 2-3 years. He's not the problem. Maybe he's got some things to work on, but he is not the problem. And so I looked at them and I said, okay, you've declined by 8 people on average every year. I went around the room and I counted. Guess how many elders they had? 8. And I said, if you guys had just done your job as elders, as leaders in the church, and won one person to Christ every year and assimilated them into the church, if you, the elder board, had just done this, your church wouldn't have declined. For those of you who are leaders in your church, are you doing the work yourself? Because for many churches, if just the leaders, forget the people, now they should be doing the work of evangelism as well. But if just the leaders would do their job, churches wouldn't decline. And we're talking about winning 1, maybe 2 people to Christ a year and bringing them to the church. That's very doable. So I will say this, how do we get people back? Are your leaders doing it? Are your leaders actually doing the work? And that's a challenge to all of you. It's a challenge to me. I know I can get so busy in the church bubble as a pastor that a month, 2 months go by, and I'm like, I haven't even invited anybody to church. I haven't even shared my faith. Goodness. I think churches can recover. I think churches can recover well. I think there's a lot of good that's happening, not only in in churches in general, but in our tribe specifically. I think Dallas is a great place to be right now in terms of growth and uh, culture and climate. And I think I think you guys are in a really, really good spot. But you got to know your community. Point one, we got to work on attendance frequency instead of people come once a month. Let's get them back every other week or two or three out of 4 or 5 times. Three, let's focus on 6 month strategies, something our people can latch onto. Four, let's be bridge builders, not bridge burners. And let's be very careful where the drama goes in our church and where the energy is expended. And point five, are we ourselves as leaders doing the work of evangelists? Because most churches, if just the leaders did the work, not the people should too, but if just the leaders did the work, they wouldn't decline.